So what did we put in here? What did we want to talk about? What did FEMA agree to fund to make this happen? Well, first, we talked about the role of planners in hazard mitigation. What is that role? Well, first of all, to talk about what belongs where. If there's one signal responsibility for urban planners, it's to discuss in public policy what belongs where in a city. Things have places where they belong, and they have places where they don't belong, like floodplains. We had 4 planners, many of whom were not familiar with this process, an explanation of hazard mitigation planning and the Disaster Mitigation Act. We talked about then how to integrate that hazard mitigation through all aspects of the local planning process, which is what I'm going to talk about as we go on. We integrated the concept of a safe growth audit, and I know that that's been used in Charlotte. Is Tim here? Yeah, that is a gift, our gift to consultants to talk to communities about how to assess their local codes and ordinances to find the weak spots with regard to hazard mitigation and fix those. And then we included 6 case studies, which I'll talk about as we move on. And we had some overall findings and recommendations, which I'll talk about. Now this is just me down in, on a shrimp boat down in the bayous to show you that we don't just hatch all this in the office. I do get around a lot. So I want to start here, before I get into the report itself, with a little case study. Everybody familiar with the Iowa floods in 2008? Pretty much. We're going to do a little case study here. Anybody want to, we got those tickets, Ed. Anybody want to guess what this scene represents on a normal day? Well, a little more specific than that. It is dry land, yeah, but what normal use it's put to? Park. This is City Park in Iowa City during the 2008 floods. Now, the reason I put this picture in this presentation is to raise the question for people. Now, you know, this is okay given that the water from the Iowa River overflows, took over the park basically for the summer, and eventually the water drains away. We may have a lot of mud and some fixing up, but that's one good use of open space in a public park. But we didn't do this all over the place in Iowa City. And by the way, I used to be in Iowa City about 30-some years ago. I was a grad student there. I still teach out there as adjunct faculty at the University of Iowa. I teach their course on disaster mitigation in the School of Urban and Regional Planning. And one thing I raised is, suppose the city had been dumb enough at some point to allow this space for development instead of reserving it as a park, what would be the condition of those houses or apartment buildings under these circumstances? A big mess, right? So other scenes from Iowa City, because not all the decisions made there were quite as savvy as City Park. Off to the left and further closer up in the right is a building on the campus. Even though I am technically a part-time employee of the university, I'm perfectly happy to bite the hand that feeds when I think that some criticism is appropriate. This is the Advanced Technology Laboratories, a building known as ATL, sitting on the banks of the Iowa River. It looks like a fort from the outside, and you'd say, how could the water ever possibly get in? Except that the ventilation system was in troughs on the floor, and the water found its way in, and once it found its way in, it bubbled up. And guess what? On that ground floor, as if they didn't have some upper floors where they could put this stuff, the university lost $26 million of scientific equipment during that flood. During a field trip for my class that year, we went to that building, among others on campus that had been flooded. I asked the question of the university's spokesman for that facility. Since nobody else had asked the question at that point, I said, well, if nobody else is going to ask this question, I will. Why is this building here in the first place? Anybody want to take a shot at what the answer was? No, no. University had already had the land. Did somebody say scenic? You get the ticket. Come and get it. Oh, by the way, the guy that said park should also get his ticket, whoever that was. Okay. Let's take that back to the park guy, whoever he was. Yeah, the answer was we like the aesthetic views of the river. Honest to God, that was the answer. As if you couldn't put the equipment upstairs, as if you couldn't find another place on campus to put this building, as if you thought it was invulnerable and could never flood. And, I'm sorry? Yeah, well, yeah, you noticed that. So you like the aesthetic views of the river, but you don't have very many windows for, yeah, right. What are you going to say? Other scenes from Iowa City, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but I'll give you some idea of on campus. The university has a number of buildings in vulnerable places, some of which are being rebuilt. So here's a problem with institutional mitigation, right? The university actually has a separate hazard mitigation plan from Iowa City. They do their own planning. There's a separate jurisdiction technically. Any of you have, big institutions in your jurisdictions? That's another issue in terms of working this out. In total, in 2008, the university suffered $750 million in losses to its facilities. It owns a lot of land on the riverfront. Some of it's better used than others. Down the street, this is a Dubuque Street, which had just barely gotten the water off at the point when I got out there to take these pictures about 3 weeks after the floods. By the way, I could not have gotten to some parts of Iowa during the floods because roads were blocked and facilities were blocked off and so forth. If you weren't already out there, you weren't coming out right at that moment. That street was blocked off. It was also blocked off for 2 whole months back in 1993. They're looking at elevating that road at a cost of about $10 million one of these days. It still hasn't happened yet. Down along the riverbank, on the top picture, you see some houses that are being elevated. Some were also relocated. They had a lot of these properties that were sitting right on the banks of the Iowa River, and obviously some of them took a beating. Down below is an area known as the Idlewild condominiums, which was built on a little bit of 1 foot of elevation to get above the base flood elevation. But then the problem is if you bring in fill and build that on a knoll, the area around it is still going to flood, and so you're basically sitting inside of a moat. Big problem. Iowa City has its issues. So does neighboring Coralville, which is sort of the bedroom suburb, except it's also a very big commercial district now. Take a look at the parking lot, take a look at the river. That's the business district right behind it, and that's 3 weeks after the peak of the flood. Big problems. I actually have a video that shows how fast that water was moving, which you can't see here, and it was still moving pretty fast at that point. And then we got Cedar Rapids. And then to the left, you see one of the neighborhoods with all the debris that's being moved out. I don't remember how many tons of, millions of tons of debris were removed out of that city. Some of the businesses to the right, huge damages. You're going to see some of the statistics in a moment. But most importantly, anybody ever been to Cedar Rapids besides me? Ed, a couple people in the back. What you see in the middle is Mays Island, where City Hall used to be located. No longer is it there. Mays Island was completely overtaken by the flood, so you can't actually see the island. You can only see the buildings sticking out from underneath. And then more scenes of debris, a church that's flooded. There's another view of Mays Island from the air. Serious problem, huh? So that all's been evacuated. A lot of City Hall was relocated to a site off on the northwest side that was pretty high and dry. Now it's back downtown, but in a much more secure building. Huge expenses, huge costs. So what happened in Cedar Rapids? As you can see, the previous flood of record was 20 feet on the Cedar River. This time it hit 31, over 31. on June 13th. The combination of the crest of the river, there was already flooding coming from upstream, combining with a big thunderstorm that hit downtown Cedar Rapids just as that crest reached downtown Cedar Rapids, and next thing you know, you've got flood-ageddon. 10 square miles of the city covered in water. There's the number on the debris removed. They were extremely fortunate in not having any deaths. They were very quick and efficient about getting people out of there, but they, had about over 18,000 people in the flood area. 10% of the city evacuated. I mean, look at the numbers. You can see that this is a really huge impact for a city of 125,000 people. Little picture of their flood map. They actually did work with the Corps. They were very smart, though. Within 5 days after the flood, the City Council had adopted a series of flood recovery goals that empowered the staff to just go ahead and get things done that will further those flood recovery goals. Within 5 days, they were thinking very fast. They also spent their own money to expedite a Corps study, Army Corps study, for the downtown area along the riverfront. They had a consultant from Boston, Sasaki Associates, with a team of sub-consultants that was actually already at work on a riverfront redevelopment plan, and they persuaded the consultant to turn that into a flood recovery plan instead, because guess what? The situation's a little different now. And so they actually were able to expedite this thing and get what ordinarily is a very long process of flood study with the Corps done in just a couple of years. Some more statistics on their impacted facilities you can kind of see, also affected areas outside in Lynn County. The actual, overall in Iowa, you had Iowa City, which is about a 45-minute drive southeast of Cedar Rapids, hit, as you saw, and some of the surrounding areas. You had Cedar Rapids. You had areas further upstream along the Cedar and Iowa rivers. I mean, this is pretty much a flood that affected numerous communities all over eastern Iowa. This particular business showed a certain amount of temporary resilience and reopening in 2 weeks, but eventually acceded to reality and took a buyout from the city of Cedar Rapids and moved out of there. They had a railroad bridge that collapsed that affected a lot of the downtown industries like Quaker Oats, Penford, and some other major employers. This river, as you may have noticed, runs right through the core of the downtown of Cedar Rapids. And at one point, the flood basically collapsed this railroad bridge, which had to be rebuilt. Nonetheless, because of the effectiveness of their approach, the efficiency of their approach, the fact that they involved the public in a series of neighborhood planning meetings, trained their staff in meeting facilitation, did a ton of outreach to develop an effective recovery plan. They actually won an award from APA that I think did a lot to bolster the feelings of the city staff that they had really done a good job and served a good purpose in spite of all the hours that they had to put in, which were enormous. So the reason I'm leading you through this is to set the stage for what happened subsequently at the state level with public policy. Can states and communities learn from disasters and not simply just experience them? Well, I think there's proof here that they did. In 2000, that should say 2010, I'm sorry, just 2 years later, the Iowa legislature passed something known as the Smart Planning Act. This was a product of cooperation with the US EPA and its Office of Smart Growth at the time. Now it's the Office of Sustainability, and FEMA in a memorandum of understanding on working on solutions on this stuff. And basically they incorporated 10 smart growth principles for Iowa planning, and for the first time 13 recommended elements in local comprehensive plans. Now mind you, before this, Iowa was one of my little points in talking about how states manage the process of comprehensive planning, because they had, while they provided authority for local governments to do comprehensive plans, they didn't mandate anything, and they also said nothing about what a comprehensive plan should contain, unlike 47 other states. Now there's only 2 states left that say nothing. I won't say who they are, but one of them is a neighbor of yours. Iowa got out of the trap of being a state that never told anybody what a comp plan should be, even though it said zoning should be consistent with the comprehensive plan. Lawyer's field day, right? Now there are 13 recommended elements that the state spells out in comprehensive plans, and one of them is a hazards element. In the hazard mitigation element, I want to read this language to you because I think it is extremely important, the way that they phrased this and what they were laying out as public policy. So this hazards element should contain objectives, policies, and programs that identify the natural and other hazards that have the greatest likelihood of impacting the municipality or that pose a risk of catastrophic damage as such hazards relate to land use and development decisions, as well as the steps necessary to mitigate risk, and in italics, this is my italics, after considering the local hazard mitigation plan approved by the Federal Emergency Management Agency. In other words, they are saying that local hazard mitigation plan for DMA should be a basis for policy in the comp plan, and that those 2 things actually ought to work together. Now, they did elect a new governor subsequently later that year. He phased out the Rebuild Iowa office that had fostered a number of very good procedures and policies for the reconstruction after the 2008 floods. New governors make new decisions. That's, part of it. But there was a consideration of repealing this Smart Planning Act, and then they thought better of it and dropped that. So it stays in place, and it is still on the books. Unfortunately, they decided to phase out the Rio website materials on the state website, but those were taken over by the University of Iowa. So those of you who are interested can go to the University of Iowa website at iowa.edu and plug in Rebuild Iowa office, and you can find all the plans and materials from that effort. So having given you that case study, which, by the way, that Smart Planning Act was passed in Iowa the same month that our report came out, which I thought was just wonderful timing, because it reinforced the message for us about what it is we should be trying to do, which is to tie these things together. In the report itself, we did a series of case studies, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each one of these, but I do want to at least introduce them to you, and then we can take questions afterwards. But I do want to discuss our strategy in terms of the way we chose them. Because we went through a laborious process of consulting all the state hazard mitigation officers to get their suggestions for good candidate communities for case studies. We looked at a number of documents. We put out a call for information from APA on our electronic systems. And when we then went through the process of sorting out the possibilities, we had about 53 candidates and narrowed it down to 6, but one objective was we didn't want small jurisdictions to look at some big jurisdiction and say, well, yeah, but we don't have those kinds of resources, so what can we do? We deliberately decided that we would pick 2 that were large jurisdictions that would show what you could do in those kinds of places, 2 intermediate size and 2 small town and rural, so that we could show also that some places with smaller jurisdictions, smaller sizes, smaller populations, were still capable of making some consequential decisions that affected hazard mitigation. So the 2 large ones were Lee County, Florida, which is where the home of Fort Myers in that area, about 600,000 people, I think. Both of these are fast-growing areas, as Tim can attest, in Charlotte, and Charlotte-Mecklenburg County, a joint jurisdiction. In Lee County, Basically, you know, they brought together mitigation for the county and 5 municipalities into one unified plan for the whole county. Integrated the hazard mitigation strategy with the local comprehensive plan so that they complement each other. And they carry out hazard mitigation through a series of, it's not just the comp plan, but other county level and municipal policies, through government expenditures, development regulations, working through the whole system. Because when we talk about this integration at APA, we're talking about several things. Integrating hazard mitigation priorities into community visioning and goal setting. Integrating not only into the comprehensive plan, but other kinds of plan making, because many cities and counties have, you know, area plans for particular, like a corridor plan or a downtown plan. There are opportunities there to identify possibilities for hazard mitigation. Functional plans like transit plans and sewer plans and so forth. We talk about the implementation tools. How do you drive implementation through things like zoning codes and subdivision ordinances so that the opportunities you have identified actually take root? We talk about what we call development work, which is sort of a basket that includes some of the implementation things like site plan review, where you get down to the level of actually approving a particular development plan for a new subdivision. And where are the things that you should be looking for to improve hazard mitigation at that level? And then finally, the capital improvements programming of the community, because that's where the big ticket items are that may, in fact, involve either some wise spending or some waste of money. So, all of that. In the case of Charlotte, one of the earliest communities to quantify and map flood elevations. I won't spend a lot here because Tim's going to talk about a lot of this later, but certainly I think you will find from Tim's presentation that they have been a real vanguard in looking at future conditions, figuring out how to make decisions that will have some serious consequences down the road. Just a little view of Charlotte that I always like, partly because it almost kind of reminds me of the Wizard of Oz scene, where they're marching through the poppy fields. But they're getting ahead of the next flood. Tim will, they've got some great communication tools. I'll let Tim get into all these details, but here's an issue of, how to kind of roll out these maps to show not just the FEMA-based floodplain, but the community's larger goal of containing development within the community floodplain area. So key ingredients there, they brought stakeholders to the table, did a lot of good public involvement, posed alternatives and future land use maps and so forth. So all I did was set the stage for you, Tim. The intermediate jurisdictions, Roseville, California really became our poster child, and Julia Burrows, who used to be the deputy city manager in there, and Tim and I, for a while, were doing a set of workshops for APA, training workshops on planning flood-resilient communities. So we brought together the best. They had a serious problem with their floodplain. As you can see in this 1995 flood, 358 properties flooded. It was a pretty big deal. They're sitting up against the mountains almost in the Sacramento area, just northeast of Sacramento, but a very fast-growing suburb that I think is somewhere around 120, 125,000 these days. And the other one we chose, intermediate size, was Berkeley. Berkeley is not a flood story primarily, it's primarily seismic, but they also have wildfire problems. But they've done a great job of working on seismically strengthening some of their buildings. Roseville's an interesting case study because they have had a lot of disaster experience, and they have chosen to learn from that experience rather than continue repeating it. Both man-made and natural, and even, the man-made, even including a young man who set fire to the mall around Christmas time, big arson. They've had everything that you can imagine at one time or another. But they've taken action, and they set a goal back a number of years ago of becoming the nation's first Class 1 CRS community, and achieved that. And so that's they are, and that reduced flood premiums, as you know, by 45% as a result. 5% with every step from Class 9 on up. A tremendous achievement on their part. They use their, now California does mandate local planning. This introduces an issue that's worth considering here. So local jurisdictions, municipalities must have a comprehensive plan. It's not optional in California. And that plan must contain a safety element. Now originally, safety element in California was focused on seismic safety. Now it's basically an all hazards, dealing with floods and wildfires as well. And so they used their general plan safety element as a tool for determining flood hazard mitigation policy back at the time of those big floods in the 1990s. They developed some strong links between that plan and other existing plans. They've really had some good citizen involvement. They are real pioneers, in my opinion, in terms of creating what I call a culture of preparedness. And also trying to, leverage some other goals through mitigation. They've been a leader in California on state climate change policy. They've really represented a great convergence of these kinds of issues. In the case of Berkeley, they had one of the first hazard mitigation plan at the local level in California. They got on the stick with this stuff. Their issue is that they have a lot of soft story apartment buildings that are seismically weak, that need to be modified. And of course, those are all private buildings that were, for the most part, built before more modern seismic codes created stronger standards. So what do? Well, they're creating incentives to get the property owners to do what needs to be done, but also providing a bit of a stick in advertising those that are not in compliance, and make so that potential renters are aware of the dangers of the building in question. So it works from both ends. They've also done all the linkages to their general plan, collaborated with the university in this instance, done a lot of great work. But it raises an interesting question: how much do California planners, who are clearly in the forefront on a lot of these issues and have a very strong state office of emergency services, how much, at the time at least, were planners aware of what they needed to do on this front? Well, you can see this is a survey that was done as part of a project by Cal Poly, a team at the University of California Polytechnic Institute down in San Luis Obispo, looking at this very theme of integration. And these are their responses from the surveyed planners of what they knew of the relationship between this safety element and the local hazard mitigation plan. Well, about 3% said, we use the same plan for both purposes. Great answer. About 12% said they adopted as part of the safety element, but they add other things. Still a great answer. Another 23%, at least it's referenced, so there's some connection there. 18% said there was no connection between these plans. Not a good answer. And even more scarier was that a third of the planners, as you can see, didn't know what the connection was. Now, if that's the state of affairs in California, and admittedly this survey is now 7 years old, but if that was the state of affairs at least, and I hope it's a better situation today, it raised the question, what about planners in other states around the country where the state is less proactive than it is in California? Just to give you an idea quickly of the scope of the problem in Roseville, they've got all these streams that basically are coming out of the mountains. Basically, Roseville's topography is that you've got water coming out of the Sierra Nevadas to the east, coming down into the city, through all these creeks. By the way, the worst flooding was on Dry Creek. Figure out where the names come from. That water then gradually makes its way down into the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta area, which flows into San Francisco Bay. That Sacramento-San Joaquin Valley is the home of some of the most troubling levees anywhere in the nation. There is a reason why Governor Schwarzenegger, after Katrina, got spooked looking at his situation in that Delta area, which has thousands of levees, some of them surrounding ring dikes surrounding little islands out there that were being farmed with, subsidence because of water draw from below. And so you've got you're farming in an area on an island that's below sea level with a ring dike surrounding, and then you have the seismic threat that could in fact bust some of those levees. You had quite a situation. This is the Folsom Dam, speaking of big threats, because it's upriver from Roseville. If this ever broke, the maps show that Roseville would be under about 50 feet of water. Pretty serious issues. So Roseville has adopted a number of plan goals. As you can see, protect lives, reduce injury, minimize damage. It's the kind of thing that you would hope that a community would set as its goals for public safety. The small towns and rural areas, we did not, as I said, want people to say, we can't do that stuff because we're just a little town and we don't have those kinds of resources. So we looked at two good examples, one being in Bourne, Massachusetts, on the neck of Cape Cod, the other being Morgan County. Now, mind you, I want to make clear that no matter which town we're talking about, I am not standing here to tell you that everything is perfect and rosy in each of these places, just that they have made progress and done something that mattered. In the case of Bourne, basically what they've got is a canal that splits the town at the neck of Cape Cod that creates an opportunity for major storm surge, and if there's ever a direct hurricane hit on Cape Cod, they're in trouble, much like the Industrial Canal in New Orleans, which was then affected by the Mr. Go that fed water straight at it. So they had some real constraints in terms of choices of development sites. Their downtown was vulnerable, but their approach was to know what it was they were in a position to do to get that information out, provide their developers through this flood mitigation study with some sound, cost-effective strategies for flood mitigation, and to emphasize, as did Roseville, that from an economic development standpoint, if they could tell people we are trying to build a safe community, that we are working actively to achieve that goal, that is actually good for economic development. It is not in conflict with economic development, because who wants to invest money in a place where they're going to lose it in a disaster? Some people might. Obviously it happens. Smarter money goes elsewhere. In the case of Morgan County, this is a little town community up in the hills northeast of Salt Lake City, about 7,000 people, not very highly populated, trying to protect its residents from things like landslides and seismic hazards, while facing some influx of wealthier people from cities like Salt Lake City, trying to build second homes up in the mountains. And the interesting thing in their case was that they made some real connections between their vision of what they wanted to maintain as a rural community with a rural quality of life and hazard mitigation to protect that way of life. Just a quick picture, won't go into detail here about Bourne, but basically moving some of their downtown into higher ground and mapping that out in this picture. There's that picture of that gap. There is the Cape Cod Canal with the downtown area immediately on the north side of that. So there's a picture of the canal. If you go off to your left, the downtown is up above there on the bluff, but in the event of a high storm surge, it's not a whole lot of protection. So what did we find out in this study? Well, here's our summary of what works. Complementary goals and objectives between the local comprehensive plan and the local hazard mitigation plan. Implementing the hazard mitigation through those government expenditures and regulations. documenting existing and predicted future conditions, which you'll hear more about from Tim with regard to Charlotte. But, you know, over and over throughout this, a lot of emphasis on mutual reinforcement between hazard mitigation goals and what's in the comprehensive plan and the implementation of those comp plan goals in order to get somewhere with land use as it affects hazard mitigation. There are some things that don't work, and the very first one is procrastination, as you can see. We deliberately put that at the top of the list, or to get a little more coarse, as I like to say, the hazard that you ignore today is the one that's going to bite you in the butt tomorrow. If you wait long enough, it's going to get you. Failure to involve planners in the process, failure of planners to get involved in the process, failure to engage the public. We've got to have public buy-in on this stuff to make it work. Investing in redevelopment without accounting for hazards, what a waste of money. And failure to use other plans to address hazards. And we keep talking about certain ideas, and I'm going to emphasize one at the end here. But first off, learning from disasters. That's the whole point of that little case study about Iowa. They actually did demonstrate that they learned something from that situation. Start to change now, the direct opposite of procrastination. Strengthening the integration of hazards with other kinds of planning activities. And then finally, here's the key to the whole thing. I'd like to put it in a little bit of alliteration here. Think linkages. You've got numerous elements in a comprehensive plan. Housing, transportation, land use. Those are some of the typical ones, but you know, California specifies 7, Iowa recommended 13. How you divide the pie and constructing a comp plan is less the important point than the fact that in many of those elements, for instance, transportation, there are opportunities to identify hazard mitigation projects that need to be done that can also then, in some of those cases, be fed into the capital improvements plan. Link those things, cross-reference between that hazards element and that transportation element, or housing, if there are housing issues that implicate, or whatever it is, economic development, historic preservation. How many people are in a community that has lost historic properties because of flooding or other disasters? Quite a few. Think about all the linkages in the plan that provide opportunities. So I'm going to conclude here by saying that if imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, we've been nicely flattered by our sponsors. FEMA provided the money for this, but they have also followed through with some of their guidance. And so at the federal level, national level, they provided this particular study about integrating hazard mitigation into local planning with case studies and tools. There's the link. There is similar guidance at several regional levels now, one example being from Region 10, which did its own case studies within Region 10 out in the Pacific Northwest. And there is the contact information, and I'll be happy to take whatever questions we have time for.
So Jim, since you're hooked in with the planners, how much of a gap still exists with land use planners and the connection and integration with hazard resilience? I mean, how much more work do we have to do to make it, not an afterthought, but to get that collaboration just part of doing business?
Yeah, I think we still have a fair amount of work ahead of us, but there is some very, very clear progress. And I think one thing that I can say with absolute confidence at this point is that the level of interest among the planners has risen dramatically in recent years. Let me give you an example to support that assertion, because I did this presentation, not this presentation, but a presentation about that very point back in July at the Natural Hazards Workshop, where we were looking at the future of various professions connected to hazards. And I showed them 20 years of session attendance data from our APA National Planning Conference going back to 1995 in Toronto through Seattle this year. Back in 1995, mind you, following Hurricane Andrew in 1992, Midwest floods 93, Northridge earthquake 1994. We go into April 95. There's 2 sessions, drew a total of 73 people at a conference with over 3,000 attendees. Not very impressive, right? I was there. I know what a tough slog it was to get people's interest. This year in Seattle, granted, events have kept pushing people. Katrina, Indian Ocean tsunami, Sandy. In Seattle, we had 17 sessions in a track on climate change and community planning, looking at those specific issues that drew over 2,200 people and more than 600 others, almost a grand total of 3,000 for combination. The others attending a series of 6 sessions having to do with hazard mitigation and disaster recovery that were not connected to that climate track. So, that's a 4,000% jump in interest at that session. I can see it in students in planning schools. There's rising level of interest. I keep getting students in my class at Iowa every year, and they're intensely interested and well aware that some of the future lies in addressing these issues. So I think we're at the, there's a tsunami of planner engagement on this thing that is coming in the next decade that I think is really, I'm very optimistic about that. I think that it's going to make a big difference.
We are very lucky to have Jim present what, to me, was the clearest, most concise presentation of work, which I think is representing 10, 12 years. And it's Jim's, I've seen and followed his work, it's his dedication to this one message of integrating hazard mitigation into planning that has resulted in the many successes mentioned, and especially the Green Book, which is a guide that, in fact, the Community Ambassador program that we'll be producing will be one of the key references. So Jim, thanks, and great to share the platform with you.
Thank you. By the way, not only did the references from FEMA at the regional level in supporting this message, this year, for the first time at the state level, the state of Colorado commissioned a guidance document, put out an RFP, hired consultants to develop guidance customized for Colorado communities on the same theme of integration. So it's starting to move down to the level of state policy, which I think is also great. Thank you.